Civility has, almost from the beginning of the mayor's formation and thinking about the Safe City Task Force, Civility has almost from the very beginning been a part of that. The mayor, I think, recognized very early on that the perception of how safe a community is and the perception of how secure its residents feel, its members feel, has a lot to do with the quality of the interaction that those residents, those members of that community have on a day-to-day basis. That when you have tense relationships between people, when altercations are common, whether they're on the street or in traffic incidents, when people do not believe that their interactions with their fellow citizens are on a very friendly basis, that leads to a perception, and often the reality, that community is not a safe one, that it is not one where people can depend on each other, can rely on each other for support. People begin to feel alienated in their community. There's a decline in what we call in our report social capital. The idea that people can inherently trust each other, that a community will respond to the needs of its citizens, and that people can go about their lives in safety and security. When that social capital breaks down, there tend to become many more concerns about crime and about safety issues in general. We also happened in the work of this committee to sort of catch a wave nationally. If you read almost any news magazine and some other journals of opinion, you probably know that civility has become almost a buzzword nationally. The opening shot may have been fired last spring, last March or April, just about a year ago, when U.S. News did a cover story called America's Uncivil Wars. And we quote a little bit from that article in the preamble to our report. The article made the point that based on a poll and based on lots of other data, people are increasingly concerned about what's seen as a rising level of rudeness and coarseness in our society. And this is at all levels. It's seen as being in the media and in the relations in our political system. All you have to do is follow the news somewhat closely out of Congress and out of Washington to know that there seems to be there's been a complete abdication of the idea of civil behavior, civil discourse, international politics. But it also goes down to the level of the street as well, that people believe in their interactions on the street, in our schools, in our communities, that people are just more rude to each other, that they're more quick to anger, that they're less willing to sit down and resolve issues and problems and disagreements through debate and discussion. Our society seems to place a premium on personal expression and self-expression and sort of being loud and being outrageous. If you listen to talk radio, that comes as no surprise to you, and not much of a premium on settling issues in a quiet way through compromise and discussion. And you may have heard a couple of months ago, the president of the University of Pennsylvania appointed a national commission on civility. If you do a quick database search, as Jay Hoffman did, through magazines and periodical literature, there have been literally dozens and dozens of articles talking about this issue, often in a very high-minded way. And so one of the things we were concerned about is to not go too far off in that direction, to not make the report of our committee a sort of scholarly tome about civility and bemoaning the breakdown of American democracy and so forth. I think we were very aware right from the beginning that whatever we did had to translate into things that city government can realistically do, can realistically get a handle on where it will be recognized as having a legitimate role to play. I think we agonized for a bit. A number of members of the committee who have been on this committee are here. We agonized a bit about just the nebulousness of our task. How do you improve civility? What do you do to get people to be nicer to each other, to treat each other in a more civil way, to improve the perception of light and movement in that dimension? What we came up with are a series of recommendations that really calls for the city government to create a certain climate. We say in the preamble to our report that we're wary of being perceived as a group of elite members of the community telling the rest of the community how it should behave. Why don't you get your act in order? Why don't you volunteer more? Why don't you cooperate more? Why don't you get more involved in your community? Why don't you stop talking so coarsely? We didn't want to be perceived that way. We recognize that there are limitations to what our group, to what city government can do. But one of the things that government can do is to create a climate, to set in both subtle and overt ways expectations for how members of that community should behave, should conduct themselves.
the kinds of behavior that community values, and government can model that sort of behavior as well. And so, so I would direct your attention to the primary recommendations that we made. I think our single most important recommendation has to do with the idea of a media campaign. I assume these are in order in the packets. And this is something that we talked about from our first meeting on. We realized that people kept coming back to this idea that the mayor has to use his bully pulpit, and that other officials and leaders in our community have to use their bully pulpits. The fact that they have public's attention, the fact that they're called upon to speak to a large variety of groups and to speak with authority, that they need to set out the message that civility is important, that the way people in Bloomington treat each other is important. And we're really very indebted to Terry Skirvin from College Mall and to her colleague Denise Glessing. Is Denise here? Terry? Okay. For translating a lot of what we had talked about in our discussions into this specific proposal. This really came from Terry and Denise with a little bit of refinement by Steve Howard and Jay Hoffman and myself. We talked from the beginning of our deliberations about the mayor using his bully pulpit, but also about using media resources. And we define media very broadly to put across this message. We see this, and one of the things I'd really like to do in this meeting today is to refine what we can do in this way, but we conceive media to be very broadly, not just television and radio. We have limited access to those things. Brian Carney from WFHB said that he would be very willing to help work with public service announcements, public service ads, other creative ways of radio programming to promote this message. We're hopeful that the HT would agree to run public service ads emphasizing this message of civility. But to create those, we talked about having media competitions that students could participate in and that could be open to all members of the community to design creative posters, things which could be run as public service ads in the newspaper, messages for radio and for BCAT that would emphasize this message of civility. Some of you may remember a few years ago, IU did a poster campaign through the Commission on Multicultural Understanding, commissioned students, and mainly out of the School of Fine Arts, to do some very creative and very striking posters emphasizing the message that hatred is not something that should be tolerated, that racism is something that affects everyone, that injustices to people based on religion, sexual orientation, race, gender really harm a community and really tear it down. You know, some very striking images with slogans, a consistent look to these posters. These were displayed on campus. I think some of them were run as public service ads in the newspaper. That's the kind of thing we have in mind. So we define media as not just the broadcast and the news media, but any form of visual communication or audible communication. Another thing we talked about a lot are the ads, the ad campaigns that are very well known, such as the Take a Bite Out of Crime thing, the McGruff thing that you've probably all seen. There must be out there, or if there aren't, we should try to create a series of posters and messages that can be displayed in the mall and other places where people congregate that emphasize this message in a consistent way, in a way that people identify it as being part of a coordinated campaign, possibly going all the way up to billboards that could be seen in the community that have a consistent look and a consistent message. So, as I say, we define media very broadly. We recognize that that's the way to most pervasively get these messages of civility and public conduct across to members of our community. So that's the first recommendation. The second one is for a series of public deliberation forums. We thought at one point about having some sort of a big summit meeting before this meeting about civility issues, having some sort of a town meeting where people could come and speak and express their opinions about these issues. I think we ultimately decided that that might not work, that the people who would show up at a meeting like that would tend to be, for lack of a better term, the usual suspects, and that maybe the people who really needed to be there, who really needed to participate in something like that would not, that they'd be intimidated by that sort of a forum, that sort of a structure. And so, thanks to the work of Jay Hoffman, our Lilly Fellow, what we came up with was a proposal for a series of smaller group discussions, things that could be facilitated in schools, libraries, churches, other community organizations, with an agenda not set by the city government or by the mayor's office, not organized by the mayor's office, but simply facilitated with some materials for discussion, some talking points, booklets provided by the city government to these groups who wanted to organize their own discussion groups. These could be almost like the book clubs that a number of community organizations and neighborhood groups and church and school organizations have, where there's a little bit of facilitation, some commonality in the materials that you have made available to you, but after that it's up to the group to form its own discussion and to take the discussion in the direction it wants to go. These could possibly culminate into a larger meeting at some point in the future to talk about these issues in our community, but we sort of begin from the principle that one of the key things to improving civility is just getting people to talk to each other more, people who don't normally interact with each other, to talk about these issues. Our third recommendation is called Neighborhood Association Welcoming Strategy. This, I think, originated from a meeting in which a number of representatives from the neighborhood associations addressed the Safe and Civil City Task Force about some of their concerns, and especially Barbara Wolf from the Young Heights Neighborhood Association really put onto the agenda the idea that the state of relations between landlords and tenants and their neighbors is a civility issue. That neighbors that residents in our neighborhood are concerned about the behavior of student tenants in rental property, about the civility of their behavior and about the quality of their interaction. And when they approach the owners of those properties, those landlords, those owners, often are not as responsive as we would like to see them to be to these issues. This particular recommendation calls upon the city government to publicize a strategy and to give some recommendations to neighbors, to people who live in the midst of rental property, these sorts of properties, how to get to know their student tenants, that if you get to know the people who are living with you and in your community, you might be able to form a basis for bringing some of these problems and complaints to their attention if it comes to that, if it comes to being a problem, that a little bit of prevention on the front end, just introductions, getting to know each other, can prevent some problems down the end. Now, I think this is could be suitably linked, Jay, with another recommendation in another section that really specifically addresses the responsibilities and the obligations of landlords. And do you want to say just a little bit about that?
Just a very brief comment. This recommendation, for those of you who attended the Mitigating At-Risk Situations meeting this morning, is in direct link. It's the sister recommendation, so to speak, of a recommendation called, I can't remember the name of it now, but it has to do with the Neighborhood Association and Code Enforcement. And what it wants to do is it tries to integrate landlords into taking a more responsible approach into informing their tenants that they expect them, one, to be good neighbors, and two, by integrating the city into that, the city can then inform landlords when a violation at that property has occurred so that the landlord can in turn inform their tenant that this is just not the appropriate kind of action. So we try to take, one, a very proactive approach in this recommendation, and then a slightly more coercive, I guess for lack of a better word, approach in the Mitigating At-Risk Situations Committee recommendation. And from the neighborhood associations, we'd like you to view those two recommendations together and give us your feedback on that, and if you think it's something that can work.
So if you were to read this recommendation by itself, you might say, well, this sounds like the neighborhood associations and the long-term residents of a community having put forth all the effort to get to know their student neighbors and so forth. But there is, as Jay says, a parallel recommendation that really does underscore the obligations of landlords to nip potential problem situations in the bud and to take some responsibility for the conduct of the people to whom they rent property. The remaining recommendations have to do with, in general, raising public awareness of issues and disseminating information, creating a homepage on HoosierNet on the World Wide Web that would include civility and diversity information, having the city sponsor or at least more ambitiously participate in a diversity fair of some sort, an event that would emphasize the diversity of our community. And we're indebted to Steve Howard from the Chamber of Commerce for reminding us that appreciating the diversity, the variety of people, a variety of backgrounds, ethnic, religious, other backgrounds, members of our community is an important step in civility, because so often uncivil behavior takes place in the form of hate speech, in the form of discrimination, in the form of misunderstandings, and just a review of the hate incident reports that the Bloomington Human Rights Commission, which I chair, puts out every 6 months, indicates to you that Bloomington is not a community that's immune to those sorts of problems. So the city taking a more active role in promoting respect for the many cultures that make up our city and make Bloomington what it is an important part of improving civility and maintaining civility. And so our recommendations in those two areas, I think, really underscore that. Making civility videos, airing them on Bloomington Community Access Television. There are a lot of really interesting programs that are being produced by independent filmmakers, things that have run on PBS. You may be familiar with a series called Not in Our Town. In fact, it's re-airing on WTIU tomorrow night at 10:30. It's the story of a community, I want to say in Montana, is that right?
In Billings.
In Billings, Montana, that was hit by some very unfortunate issues of incidents of anti-Semitic discrimination. I think there was vandalism done to a menorah that was displayed in a window of a Jewish family. Is that correct? And the person who actually produced this program was in Bloomington speaking on campus a couple of months ago. In response, the community took upon itself, you had hundreds, if not thousands, I think, of homes in that community then displayed menorahs in their windows, essentially in a gesture of solidarity with that community. Really a very moving.
Yeah, Life magazine, and I think it was the September issue, had an article on it.
Yeah, and so, yeah.
Because I want to say that it was a much broader approach than that, because in addition to the anti-Semitism, there was also intimidation in a very small black church, because the black population is quite small.
Right.
And so then all kinds of congregations from other churches came in solidarity with the small black congregation, and there was a Native American kind of incident.
So the point for these purposes being that there have been some very interesting documentaries and films made about how communities have responded to these issues that we would like to see made available if we can get around the copyright issues and other things that are involved to have them made more available and seen more widely by members of our community. And then finally, as an appendix to our report, actually there are several appendices or sidebars. We have a report, a paper called Destination Civility, written by Jay Hoffman, which talks a lot about these issues in terms of a broader national discourse. There's a report on what's being done in our schools. Time and time again, we came back in our committee to what is happening in the schools. We benefited from the participation of Dr. John Coover, of Susan Bierman, the principal of Bloomington North High School, and also for some period by Steve Bonchek, the principal of Harmony School, in the deliberations of our committee. I think sometimes we were tempted to say these problems begin in the schools and the schools should try to do something to teach people civil behavior. And I think that as a group we sort of checked ourselves and realized that we didn't want to get into this game of trying to blame all the problems on the schools and put all the responsibility for solving these problems on the schools. But we did need to recognize some of the, in many cases, very creative and innovative work the schools are doing to try to promote better relationships among students and between students and teachers. And so as an appendix to our report, there's a 2 or 3 page description of what's going on in each school in the MCCFC system that is relevant to our concerns about civility. And then I guess the final sidebar, it's really actually toward the beginning of the report, is simply a definition of civility that was contributed by Lynn Ostrom, who's on the political science faculty at IU. We decided it was probably important because this is a rather nebulous charge and it means a lot of different things to different people. It's necessary to define our terms a bit. And so near the beginning of the report, about on page 7 or 8, I guess it would be, you see a 2/3 page simply headed civility. And that is the definition of civility that we as a committee decided to adopt. It emphasizes the connections between civility and perceptions of civil behavior toward perceptions of crime and safety, and also attempts to define this bigger issue that we call social capital, that civility is important to expectations, that promises are kept among people in the community and between members of the community and their government and their leaders, that reciprocity is a good strategy to follow in those relationships, and that one will be able to call on one's fellow citizens to provide assistance in times of need. The more we can build up those values and those ideas through civil behavior, the more healthy our community is likely to be. That's a real quick overview, a real thumbnail sketch of what our committee did. We hope that we've at least made some contribution in the context of all of these national commissions and learned journals that are writing and opining about civility. We hope we've made some reasonable and realistic contribution to what our community can do in the sort of environment that city government, which is really ultimately the audience of this report, can do. What I would love would be to hear your general, I guess 2 or 3 things, your general reactions to the report and to our recommendations. That would be number 1. 2 would be what we have overlooked or left out in terms of initiatives that again, city government can take or facilitate, since that is the group that will have to implement this City Task Force report, what we've overlooked, what we've forgotten. And third, to get your ideas about fleshing out the recommendations, particularly what I continue to think of as our flagship recommendation, and that is for using the media broadly defined in our community to communicate messages about civility. So with that, I would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. Let me just ask Jay, do you want to add anything? Jay was incredibly useful in drafting many of these recommendations and really doing a lot of the creative work behind, that's the basis for a number of these recommendations, as well as just keeping the committee organized and on track.
Steve, I think you've done a wonderful job of outlining the process of the committee. I really have nothing to add. The fact that, I guess I would just reiterate one thing that Steve said is it's very hard to wrap your hands around what this idea is. We started with one conception back in October when I joined the committee and started discussing it, and I think we really ended up somewhere very different by the time that we ended. And when you're talking about civility, there's one thing that comes out again and again in the report and in the definition. It's this idea that we're all in the same boat together, and we need to find ways to interact with everybody in that boat. And that's what we're trying to do in this committee, is get the word out that, you know, we need to get along and we need to make an effort. It doesn't come easy.
Yes.
The Y had started a campaign, which is their basically campaign, and it fits right in as far as I'm concerned. There were like 4 words: caring, honesty, respect was the first one. And they used different colors and things like that.
The character building
Right,
initiative.
right, and then the 4th one I can't remember. But they did call together leaders from 4-H, Boy Scouts, the business community, and things that were mentioned today when Jay was presiding over that meeting. And, you know, I mean, there's a good start there already.
And I could see, I think Steve had mentioned a couple of times in our committee meetings too, that the Y was engaged in this effort. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how we could partner with them in some way, where the Y could facilitate a discussion group about these issues that, you know, in line with our second recommendation for these discussion forums, for example. There are clearly lots of organizations out there that are concerned about this issue, and so I don't know if it's necessary to sort of bring them into some sort of big fold, or simply say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, that they're involved in a campaign which fits their mission and their membership and their needs, and that's great. We should acknowledge that, just as the schools are doing things that are appropriate to their mission, and simply applaud them for that.
Well, I feel that they lost, was it their director that was spearheading this? And maybe they had a staff cut that because they stopped the meetings.
I haven't, you know, it started, and then the only thing I see now is the posters.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know, they may be doing something, but I don't know about it.
They aren't
They aren't.
continuing like, you know, with the community out, yes.
So
So,
maybe we need to talk to Sterling, Harlan.
Other reactions, as I say, what are there things that we simply miss?
Steve, perhaps if we maybe go through the details of, I think Steve put forward, we have the first 3 and maybe 4 recommendations are clearly our most well thought out. Perhaps if we discuss specifically, one at a time, some of the more intricate details of what would be required to implement one of these, or if it's even feasible, or if it defeats the purpose, if we're getting about it wrong, that might be very useful. Again, this is a very difficult issue, and a lot of uncomfortable moments of silence are things we're used to. We certainly experienced those in the committee process.
I think too, because we were somewhat frustrated, because it's very easy to get off on a rather philosophical and theoretical or just unfocused discussion about, you know, how bad it is that people, you know, are worried that somebody's going to pull a gun out on you if you cut in front of them on the highway or something like that. All the problems, but we were very concerned, I think I was anyway, to always bring this down to the level of what can we do in terms of concrete initiatives to improve the quality of life, the perception of the quality of life. Terry, do you want to say anything just by to emphasize anything, or by introduction of the media public relations campaign, you and Denise really sort of took that and ran with it, put that in writing in a concrete
Gave
form.
it to you and then you finished it. I'm not sure that I have anything to add except to commit the mall's resources as much as we possibly can to the execution of whatever campaign is developed. We think it's, the mall can be a real good arena for reaching people, and it's a real important message to get across to folks. So we can see many ways that the mall can help spread the civility word as that campaign is developed.
It certainly is a crossroads for the community. Yeah, sure.
Well, I guess I'm thinking of, when we talk about the vote we're talking about, I think we need to even reach to the smaller kids, because you teach them manners at a very young age, and that should carry through to help them carry through. I think, I kind of missed that here. Daycares, the grade schools are doing some things, but I guess I want to reach out to more of the community and where some of the smaller kids are involved.
The human
Just
right-
everyday manners that they're missing nowadays.
What are some, then I guess the first question I would ask is, what would be the vehicle for trying to encourage that other
Well, you
than?
hit that with churches, and I think if you've got neighborhood associations, maybe an apartment complex, housing, some of our housing additions, or they have meeting places.
Is there a way that the mayor's office could facilitate getting something going along those lines?
Well, with Parks and Recs, for one thing, that could be a focus of one of their programs. I know they go to a lot of housing things, and that could be a program that they focus on.
The Human Rights Commission each
You
year,
have camps, youth camps, that could be a focus in your youth camps.
such as the YMCA camp and the Parks and Rec camps.
There's a conference held every year for providers of service to young children. I can't quite think of the name of it, right? You know when?
I think it's the SCACY conference.
Yes.
Is this something local?
Yeah.
And that could possibly.
Well, in terms of
be-
professional development for people who provide childcare in the area, promoting civility.
Yeah, the other angle, if you're trying to get a hold of the people doing childcare, go through the city of Bloomington, the Community and Family Resources Department, because they maintain the grant program and then the food program. The food program providers that are participating in that are required to do monthly training meetings. So you've got a resource there to train the providers to how to teach this to the children. And then certainly in my extended day programs, I can't do.
The Human Rights Commission each year sponsors an essay contest geared at a couple of different levels of the schools. And this year, our general theme tied in with this work was civility. And I think for the elementary and middle school kid, you can use the term civility. I forget exactly how we phrased it, but sort of thinking about how we treat each other and just being nice to each other, something like that. And I know that several of my fellow commissioners have served as judges, and that our award ceremony is going to be on May 1st. I've not read the essays yet, I've not seen them, but we decided to make our own contribution in that way to decide what to get kids in schools to think about this issue by making that the theme of our essay contest.
Staring at Steve across the way, I was thinking in terms of customer service and businesses. When we have visitors come to visit our family here in Bloomington, they always say when I take them shopping anywhere, what a friendly place it is. That when they come from New York or Chicago or someplace like that, you know, the waitresses aren't as friendly and you know, the cashiers aren't as friendly. And, you know, if we can just continue to promote that in Bloomington, if every business, if every not-for-profit, if every family thought of ways that they could be friendly and nice and what makes, how they can accommodate their customers, you know, in many different ways. And we each have our own group of people that we serve in many ways in our lives. And if we just think about how we want to be treated, and if we could do that and, you know, just make it just go out like a wave, that we would
If I
have a
could-
very civil community.
If I could follow up on that, you've really hit it on the head. We've talked a lot about it this morning about grassroots movements and the importance of starting from the ground up. The most important thing everyone in this room could do today when they leave is go out and tell someone, I live in Bloomington, Indiana. It's a safe and civil community, and start spreading the word. It starts with us.
Because I think we also recognize that this kind of thing is very cyclical, that if people in those customer service responsibilities are that way, probably a lot of that has to do with the fact that they themselves are treated that way, that they have maybe a lower level of tension and stress than people living in New York or Chicago, because Bloomington is in general a safer community. It's perceived as just a community with a higher quality of life, and that leads people to be better to each other in their interactions, and the quality of those interactions then feeds that what we call social capital, and it becomes a positive cycle. Steve, does the chamber do anything in the way of advocacy or customer service training for local businesses along those lines?
No, I don't think we have. We could. Into broader community development things, that certainly would be an initiative. There's some subtleties here that you need to think about, though. I'm reminded, and I think it has to do with the diversity issue. We may be civil to people that we're comfortable with. And Dr. Mumford tells a story of being in line in a convenience store and watching people getting their change. And everybody got it in their hand until he came and he got it on the counter. And so whether this was an overt act of sort of a racist act on the part of the person behind the counter, or whether it was a lack of ignorance, fear of unknown, or whatever it is, I don't know. But it's not just be nice, it's recognize that nice is perceived in different ways. And
Get rid of
sure.
all your prejudices.
Well, that's why we included the term diversity, which has become kind of a misunderstood or buzzword in and of itself, but why we included recognition of those non-discrimination and diversity issues in the purview of our community. For example, that's a perfect crystallization. For those of you who don't know him, Jim Mumford is an African-American faculty member at IU who's director of the Afro-American Choral Ensemble.
And he looks different.
Mm-hmm.
He's an unusual looking
Mm-hmm.
person, and I think that might have been it more than anything else, but don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, George, I think you're right. There's something we could do in that area.
Those of you who are in agencies, businesses, all of your professional lives, are you aware of poster campaigns or public service announcements or series of coordinated messages that your group makes available that are already out there? We sort of, I think Terry did a little bit of looking. We sort of said that there must be some national group like the Ad Council or something like that has a campaign, just like the McGruff Take a Bite Out of Crime. There must be something like that about civility. If there is, we haven't found it. And maybe we need to create it ourselves. Are there materials, PSAs, other things out there that you're aware of that we can make use of?
Not nationally for all ages, but at least in my program, there's posters we use for children.
What program is that? I'm sorry.
Well, the best resources, and it's like Stacy, and I'll quit talking in acronyms, it's the National Association for the Education of Young Children.
Mm-hmm.
And the Children's Defense Fund is another excellent place. But again, the message in most cases is geared to sometimes the parents, but mostly children and people that work in the field.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things in there about playing nice and manners, subliminal things.
Mm-hmm. These are materials that can be purchased
Yep.
by local groups. There may be overlap here with the youth. Should we start piling more things on the youth commission's job description?
Well, I'd let Kathy speak to that. I would just say that one thing that we didn't have time to discuss, our committee deliberation ended and the work is never done, was when we got the survey results back from the school as far as what they were doing to promote civility within the school system. I think there's some possibility there that we might be able to tap into that and expand upon it, make it a bigger deal, say, we, one, approve of what you're doing, this is what the other schools are doing, let's try to get more of it, get some excitement building, and by then, you'll get some adults involved, and we'll come up with some ideas for you and I, the old folks, older folks.
You're an old folks.
Yeah,
This community is so rich in creativity and artistic capability. There are a lot of examples, a lot of opportunities to do things like this. The one that occurs to me is every year we have a contest to see what will be on the front cover of the business directory of the chamber. And there's always a theme that's put out. And, you know, there's no reason at all the theme for next year couldn't be civility. And so you sort of, the fact that the chamber cares about that is expressed, and the fact that there are people involved, there's a press release. There's all sorts of opportunity to do this. We probably are not exploiting hardly any of it.
That's an example of one medium that's out there that disseminates a message. Does this idea of some sort of a contest have potential? I mean, we tend to do that a lot, I suppose. I don't know if it's an overused idea or not. To my mind, it wouldn't have to be limited, probably shouldn't be limited to the schools, but rather anyone in our community who has visual artistic talent, media production talent. I guess this is something ultimately the mayor's office would have to sponsor, or if there's a permanent office or commission set up to implement the work of this Safe and Civil City Task Force, it would be something that they would sponsor, and there would have to be some money and some prize, I suppose, involved in addition to the recognition. But to commission people to create in a competitive way posters and PSAs and other media that could be used, hopefully, to provide a consistent message. Does that idea have potential? Does anybody have any strong feelings for or against that approach of grassroots creation of these sorts of materials and messages?
Right. There's just continuing opportunities to do that. Another example would be every year the Bloomington Voice solicits opinions about what the best pizza is. We could ask them, who's the most polite wait person in town, or who's the nicest citizen that you know. And I think there's just about 10,000 different ways you could do this, and that's how this has got to be done. Is that it's just a thread and all sorts of things that we do. It doesn't really cost anymore. We just change the spin a little bit.
I think that might be a challenge, on the thing you were talking about before, that you can make to all the copy businesses in town.
To the copy businesses, really? How
That's
so?
their challenge. Let them get together and figure out how to collect and disseminate messages about civility and diversity and little business community involved.
How else would they do that? I'm just curious, just to flesh that out a little bit. That they would actually sponsor something, and since they control the machines that print all this stuff, they could easily disseminate it. Tell me.
I think that the elementary schools often have posters with their kids. And I remember 1-2 years ago that came to the city council, and it has to do with diversity. And some of the pictures that the younger kids drew were very excellent. And I don't know how we can encourage the school system to continue that.
I remember when the city government was in the old building, weren't there periodically sort of art displays around the common council chambers geared toward a theme?
Yes, so there was, always had some theme. I don't remember who was in charge of that, but I think that should be encouraged.
What about this idea that the city actually have an official motto? Is Tree City a motto? Is there any official Bloomington motto or slogan right now? I'm looking to members of the city council who are here with us. We have sort of floated around this idea. This goes beyond the Civility Committee, but I think we've been one of the key committees that's pushed the idea of having on city letterhead, on signs at the entrance to the city, Bloomington, a safe and civil community. There was even at one point someone came up with some some artwork or a little logo that could be used with that sort of slogan. Are we in agreement that that's both a compelling enough and an encompassing enough issue that that's a message that a majority of members of our community could rally around, the idea of a safe and civil city or a safe and civil community, to elevate that to a slogan, to city letterhead, to city signage, all the things. Problems with that? Enthusiastic about that?
I think it's a wonderful idea, except it puts you at considerable risk when you have a mass murderer down here. You know, and you get some national press. And it's a brave thing to do, because you put yourself, you make yourself vulnerable as a community. You claim to be that, and then something happens that clearly is not
I think it works the other way.
Risk the
Steve.
potential for ridicule. Go ahead.
Although that's certainly a risk, part of the idea behind this getting the word out is that when you create the expectation that this is going to be a safe and civil place, that whether or not you are safe and civil yourself, you might conform to these norms. Now, that's not to say that everyone acts rationally and you won't have random acts of violence, but what you might see, and what would be interesting to see a study done, we certainly have people at IU who could do those, is to see if we create an expectation that we are going to be safe and we are going to be civil, and we tell everybody and we write it every place, and it becomes a norm, not a law, that maybe people will say, this isn't the place where you beat up people. This isn't the place where you give people the bird and whatever.
And the motto doesn't necessarily need to claim that we are something, but maybe depict that we're striving.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
And this ties into another insight from one of the other committees, Dan Sherman's committee. Is that mitigating at-risk situations?
Carl Salt.
Safety of the environment. There's in the Fuller report, which you'll see after the task force has fully finished its work, there's the insight about what's called the broken window theory, that, just common sense, if you're in an area where trash is not collected, where there are broken windows, where property falls into a dilapidated state, that sends messages to people as to what the expectations are and what the safety of that physical environment is. And so a motto emphasizing safety and civility, that this community is self-confident enough to declare that it is a safe and civil community, works, as Jay said, to send the opposite message, that it promotes an image and a perception of order and safety in a community, which you hope becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think there is an element of risk. You've got to stick your neck out a little bit.
I agree with what Jay says. I'm not saying we should not do that. I just think we ought to understand that there's an opportunity for defending
I
there.
would say that if we're gonna go so far to have the motto, then it ought to be followed up with every single agency or department of the city having a mission statement and a set of goals and objectives and action steps for how they are contributing to the establishment of a safe and civil city, so that we don't end up with some sort of lip service there.
Sure.
That's good.
I think just the existence of this overall task force in this meeting today is a start toward that. It certainly shows, I think, the commitment of the administration on a very large macro level to these ideals, and the diversity of the recommendations.
And actually, I would add to that, not just city departments, but the interfaith council, what are the various congregations doing with regard to this issue?
Georgie, you can have a minute.
I just want to say, before we put it on anybody's letterhead, I would rather see us tell a lot of stories about how we're working to be a safe and civil city, and maybe this would be a long-term goal that we could eventually put it on. But I think when we get all this media stuff going and we start, pointing at different people that are doing things and different organizations and departments within the city, and can give statistics of how we've gone so long without having a murder or whatever, then we could say, these are examples of how we're a safe and civil city.
Julian.
I like the word working, striving, working for a safe and civil city.
Well, the trouble with that, the implication is that it's not.
Oh.
I'd like to just hang it up there and shoot for it.
Hang it up and shoot
You
for it.
bet. Just say we are one.
I think the compromise, the Personal Safety Commission at IU faced a similar issue. You don't want to send the message that it's unsafe. And so I think the compromise, Toby, you may be familiar with this, was toward an even safer campus, is the name of the publication. So it's like, toward an even more safe and civil city.
I'm not a wordsmith, but I kind of like mottos that inspire you or give you the idea to get the message across, but it isn't real blunt. I'm not saying one way or another in terms of whether the letterheads for the city should say safe and civil city. I have to frankly admit I'm a bit frustrated because I haven't read everything, so I don't know exactly what the definition of civility is. I get it that it's mutual respect and courtesy, and for me it would also be tolerance. But then I think when we get into things like politeness and niceness and stuff like that, there's so many different definitions of what that is, and I don't know what we're talking about when we talk about being nice to each other or being polite to each other. And it seems to me that we need to have some really broad views. If, for instance, if you asked a group of children to write an essay on what is civility for you, I would want to give them a whole lot more than just a blank, what is civility, because
Showing my own lack of knowledge of what the subcommittee of our commission did, I believe that some guidelines were given out to the teachers about these essays, for example, that I can tell you exactly what they said.
I know for me, in terms of doing city business, when I think about why do I regulate or put a stop sign or something like that, we live in a civilization and we have to figure out ways to get along with each other. And part of it is, say, for instance, if it's the streets, some folks have to stop and some folks go forward. So it's pretty clear, and I do feel as though there's a real attack on regulatory government going on, you know, just to relate it in terms of what cities can do. So for me, that's an issue where civility really breaks down.
Respect for the law.
Respect for law, respect for the functions of government, what governments actually are trying to achieve. It's a collective view of how people should get along with each other to a certain extent. But I also am really baffled by what really we actually mean by civility. But I would also throw out that word tolerance. If you're going to define civility, I think tolerance should be in there too, because a lot of times when people's customs are very, very different, so their politeness to each other are very, very different. But if there's an overriding picture of tolerance, then that maintains the civility.
Yeah.
So.
Pat, you certainly hit on the key thing that frustrated our committee, I think, for about 9 months. And I think all of us agreed that you know, that there obviously, as you say, 1,000 definitions of civility, but I think we were all struck at just sort of how satisfying Lynn's definition was, the way she described it in a relatively brief space, what we mean by civility, which is near the front of the report. It means, as you say, lots of different things to different people, yet there does seem to be this perception among a lot of people that society is less polite, more coarse, that our political dialogue and debate are more acrimonious and more bitter.
The me generation, we're trying to move out of the me generation into whatever is next. But can I ask you, what is the second bullet? Long-term reciprocity is a good strategy to follow. What does that mean in terms of
I'm going to defer to Jay, because Jay is more familiar with Lynn's work and has been a student of Lynn's.
This is, all of Lynn's work is based on this very bullet point, so it's not surprising to see it in here. What Lynn means is that we interact with each other more than once. If I am nice to you today, then I should be nice to you tomorrow and again and again and again. Whereas if I'm just trying to get something from you and I burn our bridge today, I might have to cross it again tomorrow. And so a long-term strategy would be one where you and I decide to get along today and we stick to it, rather than I burn a bridge whenever it's convenient. That's not a good strategy to follow, and that's what creates a lack of community, alienation, and these kinds of things.
And Pat, I think we finally just sort of came to the conclusion that we were never going to come up with one all-encompassing definition, so the best we could do would be to come up with some initiatives and that there's enough agreement on what an ad campaign might look like, or just repeating this idea of civil behavior, that was worth doing for its own sake, and also government just creating an environment where these issues can be discussed, where people can talk about them, which is where the forums come in. And so, you know, we're never going to define this as an issue, but everybody seems to be talking about it. It's a buzzword, so people must have at some level some sense of what we're talking about. So let's just let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Right, just to say one more thing in terms of your ad campaign, and on my very first point of finding quotes from history, from great thinkers, from literary folks who have just captured the idea of what it is to be a human, to relate in a civil manner with each other, rather than saying, for instance, and not to pick on Shrine North Middle School, but you walk into the school and there's a poster there about, you know, if you become a drug addict, this will happen to you or something. And I just always looked at that and I thought, how much greater if there was a great poster there that would make the kids live up to a higher expectation, rather than a fear, driving a fear kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't think that we necessarily need to say things in such a blunt way, that we can find a way to inspire
Figures
folks
like,
to.
and just what pops into mind, Martin Luther King, a quote, an appropriate quote from Martin Luther King that emphasizes the kind of behavior we're looking for. Would that be an example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Toby.
I'm just frustrated because he's been trying to say something.
Oh, I'm
last
sorry.
Oh, no, that's, well,
I agree with Pat, very much about that. I was thinking that people sitting on the city council, they'll have someone come to speak, and at the conclusion of that, Tony might say, well, that was really an assertive person, and Pat might say, no, that was an aggressive. We really have a lot of trouble, I think, defining just what it is. We think we know when it happens to us, or we think that, but I think this business of defining it really is, it's a little bit difficult. I may think some guy is really pushy to me, and someone else might say, well, no, he wasn't pushy, you're taking that too personally. Yeah. I agree with her. A little bit uncertain about how to define it.
Yeah.
I don't think we ought to get into the paralysis by analysis here either. For the parents in the room, if we had a couple of 3-year-olds playing on the floor and one was pushing or hitting or something, what would we all say?
Don't hit.
Be nice.
We'd say, be nice to your brother, Susie, right? All of us
I
would
would.
say that, and we'd all get a concept. I think we all sort of get the idea of nice. And I know you can take it from that into deep and dark recesses of the academic mind and trying to identify what exactly that means. But I think most of us on some sort of intuitive level know what it means to be nice.
Well, I know in this day and age, I know some parents would say, Johnny wasn't doing anything wrong.
Well, and then others might say, hey, hit your sister back.
Well, I think that maybe we always have to keep in mind that there are competing demands on resources. And however we end up defining civility, that we accept that there will be conflict and tension.
But that, it's one of those things where almost anything, as long as doing something, is probably going to make some improvement and some positive impact, even if we don't have the ultimate master plan or the ultimate definition. Just doing something toward this general goal is not likely to do any harm, and is probably going to do some good. Mark?
It'd be nice.
Yeah, I think there's in designing a media campaign too, I think that there's a diminishing return in trying to come up with the ultimate definition of civility, whereas telling stories of civility, seeing the column in the Herald Times, there'll be a lot more consensus on, yes, that is an example that we can all get behind. Whether it fits the definition we've been able to define in the last year or not of civility becomes beside the point, whereas we can immediately begin to tell stories, and that's where we've evolved a sense of what is civil. Sometimes it's
a recent HT article about if you do something stupid as a driver, how to acknowledge your stupidity to the other person so you won't get shot.
Yeah.
I thought that was really good.
How do you do it?
Yeah, right.
draw first.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah,
You don't use the middle finger on one hand.
Beth and then Larry.
I think as much as we don't want to get too tied down in analysis and all that, it is important to look at some of the root causes. Anonymity that adults have in their cars, for example, and lack of supervision the kids have. I know my kids, the first time they went into a totally uncivil environment was when they got on the school bus, right? And all of a sudden, I'm like cussed up and cussed down. First day of school, second day of school, third day of school. Next thing I knew, I was driving. And got them back on the bus eventually, and then I'm driving again because of all the abuse they're taking. And for a couple of years, my son rode, when he got old enough, rode his bike a mile every day because he didn't want to be on the school bus. It was too rough. He wasn't into it. And I think that we can't expect, well, you staying on that example, let's say we come to a point in this community where we think maybe we need cameras on the buses. Then maybe we should rethink that and say, no, maybe we need adults on the buses, right? The driver and somebody else. So we don't have that anonymity and that lack of supervision. So I think it's a lot of our decisions need to be based upon not having people, children, where they're unsupervised, and we're doing a lot of that through the after-school program, Wendy's program. But we have lots of holes, lots of places where we're really not doing it.
And I know you were in the youth programs committee this morning, and I guess the more we talk about this, the more I'm seeing a lot of connections between the work that a youth commission might do and the work of that youth programs committee and these issues. But again, I think so much of this just has to occur in a decentralized way. I mean, our report ultimately is concerned, as I said, with what city government and the mayor's administration can realistically do. That's not an issue. that the mayor can probably have a lot of impact on, but we can somehow encourage parents and the school corporation to come up with to dialogue and to come up with a solution, not just jump into a rash approach to the problem, to the issue. Larry?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm not sure I have the quote right, but Rodney King's quote, "Can we all just get along?" is a nice simple way of saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as publicizing incidents, the Human Rights Commission issues reports about hate crimes in the community, and maybe we need just to try to, those tell a negative story, but maybe those do provide to some extent a wake-up call. We need to try to publicize those even more than we already do, so that people do know that these sorts of incidents occur. And when people learn about that, hopefully you hope the effect it has is that people get angry and want to do something about it, because they do believe that Bloomington is the kind of place where ultimately those kinds of things should not happen. Yeah.
Do you, does the Civil Rights Commission send their annual report to the HT?
Yeah, I don't think there's an HT representative here. You know, our experience with the HT is like everyone's experience with the media. We send a copy of the hate crimes report with a press release, and it comes out every 6 months. There are times when no notice is taken of it whatsoever. There are times when it's on the front of the Region section. It's like most news judgment decisions, dependent on, it's sort of capricious. It depends on how much news there is that day. It depends if the press release gets handed to the right person whose imagination is captured by it. You know, news judgment, as I said, is always going to be capricious, and so we can't rely on that necessarily unless, you know, we don't want to sensationalize it. We don't want to make such a big issue of it that it becomes sensationalized.
I think communication is very important, and the city, I think, I don't know how far they've gone on encouraging neighborhood organizations, but I feel that, you know, campaigning, going to neighborhood groups is a moment that does increase the opportunities for communications, and civility always is a part of that. And I think that there's just not enough neighborhood organizations. I don't know how the city or about how this particular group can come up with initiatives that would encourage more groups to get together and seek out their own problems and perhaps some solutions.
That's actually a very good segue, Steve. We should probably try to solicit some feedback on other recommendations that are directly related to the media campaign, because I think that the next, well, almost all the next recommendations are ways to get this idea of civility out in alternative ways other than the media. And the very next one is, how do we get small groups of people talking about civility together, and then we take members from those groups and send them to another group and compare notes and see what they came up with, and then take that to the mayor and let him know what they came up with, and then start all over again, back to the small groups, and keep it as a process that's going. Because if we talk about civility today, you and I, and we leave and decide to be civil, by Wednesday we might have forgotten. And it's something that's ongoing. It's not something that we solve this year. Yeah.
Just want to make a point. I think, first of all, in a general sense, I think city administration needs to be very careful how they approach this. A lot of the uncivil type political and type of discussions that go around, for the city to spend tax dollars on a be nice to one another campaign is only going to kind of open themselves up to more of the same kind of uncivil sort of discourse that comes along. It's a great idea for the city to come out and promote and help elicit civility amongst the citizenry. But I think we need to be real careful about not being too trite about this, being very specific, because I see big billboards asking, you know, people's tax dollars.
The challenge is to create a climate where when people see over-the-line behavior or rhetoric, that any citizen feels that they can call that person or that organization on it.
I don't agree with Brad. I think that confrontation does not really increase uncivility. I think that you know, I've seen good debates going on when it's been very civil, and I think this is the purpose of government, to be able to discuss and debate in a civil way.
I
don't think that's gonna be a problem.
Mark, and then I'll.
Okay. Yeah, it struck me as interesting that back in the inventory of school skills that are covered, that conflict resolution shows up in a number of places. But it's something that I think that a lot of people would like to be trained in. And neighborhood associations, I think, are trying to make conflict resolution part of what we show the members and that kind of stuff. And I would love to see that be an initiative out of this group, is to have some training module in conflict resolution that's available to school kids, to government organizations, to neighborhood associations. It's a skill that is teachable, whereas civility is a big, fluffy cloud of stuff.
No, conflict resolution is a specific translation of what we're talking
And
about.
I'd love to have a training package available in conflict resolution.
And that really ties into my point, Tony, actually, I think we agree on that. It's just that, I see it, unless what goes on is pretty specific and pretty focused.
Right.
It could lead itself into a negative impact that certainly no one in this room or no one involved in this long process wants it to be.
Under this general idea that we're talking about here today, yet it has to have to be concrete, specific initiatives, and people can feel that they are advancing the cause of civility by doing a conflict resolution workshop, or by doing a politeness module for kids at Wyatt summer camp.
And I had just a quick idea, is that maybe there could be a volunteer organization out of this group of people who are so interested in it, that maybe once a month did secret shopping around areas of Bloomington, not just retail stores or whatever. But if you see someone who's been nice to somebody, or writes a letter to the editor that has a differing opinion to something that's written in a concise, civil way instead of name calling and finger pointing, that maybe once a month there can be the mayor's Safe Civil Committee
Story of the month.
story of the month, or certificates given out to 10 people who exemplify the civility of the city.
I've wondered about that. I mean, do we already have, maybe we already have too many award programs in this community, but should there be?
Never recognize people.
Okay.
Actually, we have that very idea on page 18. It's a proposal whereby we recommend that the mayor's office and members of this committee get together and continue to flesh out what this concept is, and to try to identify not the places in the community that are uncivil, but those that are civil, and give them some gold stars and give them some recognition, and gives other people something to shoot for.
Yeah, besides having a strong social service background, I also have a strong PR background, and I know we or one cannot, or at this time, get a concise definition. But if you're gonna spend whoever's budget it comes out of, if you want an impact, you have to be as clear as possible, even if it's an image, whether it's a theme, like I'm thinking, when we were talking about diversity, like the Bennington theme ad, or something, or, I mean, there are other examples, or Pat's example of using a Martin Luther King quote or a Gandhi quote or something. And it could be a series of different things, but it's
A consistent message.
Yeah, a consistent message, or try to define it as much as possible without.
More clarity.
Yeah, thank you, more clarity. Because I know if I read something, it's like, it has to be clear if I'm going to react or act.
Yeah, it can't be this sort of fuzzy ephemeral message.
About 10 minutes ago, or maybe a little less, Tony jumped across item 3 on my list to 4 neighborhood associations, and I was afraid we wouldn't get there because I'm not going to get through all 10 of these. Just a minute. Because I want to say what I think is so important about neighborhood associations. And that is, neighborhood associations don't exist only to correct people's problems. I get not quite as many calls as John Fernandez, but I'm not paid to be president of my association as much as he's paid the mayor of the city. But I get a lot of calls about conflict. And one of the things you can do to shortcut some of that is get acquainted with your neighbors when they first move in. Take the initiative, go and say, I'm involved with the neighborhood association, here's our meeting dates, we'd like for you to be part of our neighborhood. Instead of waiting around for your neighbor to contact you about some problem, because I think if you get to know people, you reduce some of this hostility or uncivil conduct or responses. If I knew you really well before I had a conflict, I would be approaching you a lot different. Had that happened in my neighborhood less than 6 months ago, where a man continued to park his RV in front of the back of, he had a boat and trailer, pickup truck and car in his own driveway. So in order to park his 27-foot RV, he had to park in front of his neighbor's lot and part of the house. And I got drug in this because the one neighbor was trying to sell a house, and he said, I'll never be able to sell a house as long as his RV's in front of my house. And so I went back and forth between these two individuals. And I finally talked to the one man who was the offender, and after exhaust, I said, in your heart, Harold, in your heart, don't you really just think this is wrong? If it were happening to you, if your neighbor on the east were parking your RV, and he must have thought about that because he paved 2 strips on the side of his house, concrete, where he pulled the RV off the street, where it's supposed to be, parked it next to his house, on his property, wasn't a threat to him. And that resolved that. But I think if we get to know our neighbors, we use that phrase, I'll get to know your neighbors, but we don't really practice that. And I think there's so much to this thing of really making an effort. You have to be a little more outgoing perhaps, and you have to take some initiative here. I do that probably too much. I'm probably too, and sometimes that'll fly back in your face because neighbors don't want it. They say, I don't care who you are, out. But I think on balance it pays to get acquainted with your neighborhood. I probably know as many people in my neighborhood as anybody living out there. I've lived there a long time, but I make an effort to do that.
That was where I wanted to take the discussion. That's my next question is going to be asked you and Larry. I mean, does this report do you some good? I guess from the standpoint of the mayor and a city task force like this, the question we have to ask is, what can be done other than hoping and praying to ensure that people like you and Larry and your fellow neighborhood association presidents, that there are more people like you and that there are people to take your place when you're done doing this job? What can we do to promote that?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's different. I mean, people react individually differently to your, but I think I have a really great neighborhood association where I live, and I think we have not just me, we have a lot of people who really care about where we live. Unfortunately, a lot of them are older people, senior citizens, and I check the obituaries to see when they're dying off. But we have a large number of people who really care about what's going on in the neighborhood. That's what it takes to do that. And you have to kind of keep working on it and encourage people. You have to go and say hello and I like the flowers in the front yard before that person calls and says, we got too many cats running loose.
Is it safe to say that we're in agreement that the neighborhood associations are sort of basic building blocks, have to be basic building blocks of an initiative like this? And so then what we need to focus on is what can we do to strengthen those organizations and ensure their health?
Jim's excessively bashful. I think the reason it's a good neighborhood association, there's others, is because 1 or 2 individuals have decided to take the effort to make it so. And start out with a black party on the 4th of July and eventually work it into the neighborhood watch, however you do it. And somehow I think you've got to identify the people who can exercise that leadership and teach them about how that's done. It's a skill. And you can also do it by holding up people as examples in HT stories, teacher stories, and so forth. But I don't think it happens out of the whole cloth. I think it takes a catalyst and usually some individual who's just going to do it. So is that how it happened with you two?
It's sort of publicly recognizing that work, a way to get other people to step into those roles.
Establish the expectation that in this neighborhood there must be some human being that would be have the time and the energy and the skills to do this, and look around and say, well, maybe it's Jim down the street.
Let me lighten this just 30 seconds or less by the most uncivil act I ever had about 10 years ago on Kirkwood. Started across the street toward what is now the new library corner. And a woman with a baby on board, when that was so popular, almost ran over me. I mean, that's the closest I've ever came to getting hit by a car. I stepped out, she gave me this dirty look, and the last thing I saw was a baby on board disappearing down the street. I thought, what is this about? She doesn't want me to harm her child, but she doesn't care
she kills me.
Well, now there's, civility, it's a broad spectrum, what you got there.
I just wanted to say that what I think is really important to do is much going at the grassroots level as possible. Neighborhood associations are loosely organized. And so you want to be careful about placing too much responsibility on that kind of an organization and making sure that what you provide is support at some level that is more organized for them.
Just that does have to be part of the strategy, strengthening and recognizing getting other people.
And I would hope that the welcoming strategy that we lay out, and although that's primarily a strategy aimed at the student neighborhoods, we realized that was responding to a particular need. That the goal of that strategy wasn't to be the end-all be-all, but if that strategy could spark ideas that we could integrate with other neighbors, it's just a platform. If we can send one brochure out, we know that there are hundreds of smart people out there who'll come up with something even better, and they'll get it going on their own. We're just hoping to provide that spark, and I think that's an excellent comment.
Yeah, Pat.
I wanted to say, I think that neighborhood associations have been really strengthened in the last 3 to 4 years. There's a council of neighborhoods. It's true it is loosely organized, but Cincinnati, for instance, some of their zoning and planning changes have to be approved by neighborhood associations before they can actually go into effect. So, and that isn't the way it is here, of course, but I mean, there's a lot of flexibility in how far neighborhood associations can evolve. And I think the mayor has certainly put a lot of strength and, simply by including the neighborhood associations in these surveys and also by allowing the associations to copy the newsletters through the city, and there's that kind of support for associations, which I think can only help. It's a tremendous grassroots resource for everybody.
Yeah, someone mentioned a training program of some sort. I think the Council of Neighborhood Association would be a great place to
The
start
conflict
with
resolution idea that Mark was talking about.
Right. If it got to Kona, the Council of Neighborhood Associations, then it can go from there out into all of the neighborhood associations. And I can't see why anyone would be against it.
John or Pat or Tony, those who know the city administration, are there people right now employed by the city in a human resources capacity or a training capacity who could do that kind of workshop? I know we've got people at IU in physical plant and in training and so forth who do workshops on conflict resolution. I can't imagine people like that would be too difficult to find.
We have somebody in human resources.
Right.
The Community and Family Resources Group from time to time sponsors those kinds of initiatives for other organizations, and it seems like a natural audience for them to do things like leadership training, conflict resolution training, capacity building. And again, I think the first weekend in June, we're going to have our first neighborhood issues forum. And from that, I think we can have a structure to go back and help the neighborhood associations communicate success stories, things that they've tried and haven't worked, and be a real network of ideas to strengthen some of the newer organizations or even help build them where there aren't any.
So it would be nice if we want to develop materials about a welcoming strategy and so forth. It'd be wonderful to have those.
I think the housing and neighborhood development department is a good place to start, and then they can work interdepartmentally with the community and family resources people to help do some of the board training or conflict resolution training, etc.
Steve, were you trying to jump in earlier?
Just Jim always got nice ideas, and once we hit on it, reminded me of something we talked about in this process, and I don't think it was identified in this report. But that is the idea of providing opportunities for social interaction without some sort of agenda. And I think where it came from was some organization called One Atlanta. I think it's One Atlanta. Do they remember that or know anything about it? The idea is there's apparently a tension between the black and the white community, and instead of getting together and discussing race, they got together and shot pool or went to baseball games or had a picnic or had a softball game. And from that came an opportunity for social intercourse. And then from that came some better understanding. It wasn't this tense thing where we're sit across the table and talk about black-white issues. I think it's an important thing to do here. We don't maybe have as much clear, obvious tension, but there's quite a bit of tension in a lot of ways, either economic or racial and others here. And I wish we'd include this in the report.
If we can do that.
Chuck.
There's a recommendation in the Enhancing the Safety Environment group that suggests a geographic information system that shows throughout the city and neighborhoods and blocks and so on, crime statistics. And it strikes me that that would also be a very good thing to take to a session of neighborhood associations, just to review that with them and use that as a means, I think, for stimulating activity in the neighborhood association, stimulating interaction.
And actually, the Human Rights Commission has talked about, Barbara McKinney, I think, is in the process of developing a similar thing for where hate incidents occur in the community as well. One thing I haven't heard to my relief, but I'm wondering about your thoughts about this, is this an elitist initiative? Now, maybe that's all because we're part of the elite in the community, but there was a very interesting article I gave to members of the commission that appeared in Nation magazine, which sort of took a debunking attitude toward this whole national movement of civility, saying this is really political and social and cultural elites talking down to everyone else, and before they tell the rabble how to behave, they ought to get their own act in order, and their own political and financial and sexual scandals in order before they start telling other people how to behave. Are we at risk of that kind of perception?
I think that's really an unfair and silly kind of charge. I really think it's a silly approach. I mean, all you have to do is look at the situation like we had last year, where the two young kids from Ellettsville, I believe it was, were on Route 67 and got into a civility, really, argument with a guy in another car. And the guy stopped, they pulled around in front of him, stopped, walked back, the guy shot and killed one. I mean, that's a pretty serious issue. Yeah. And I think taking the kind of approach that this magazine takes.
I mean, I guess the kinds of things I hear us talking about are kind of grassroots, everyday life, enough kinds of things that they don't make us vulnerable to that charge. But I still saw a number of people nod sort of very enthusiastically.
Well, no, I'm just saying that I have read those critiques and more than just the one that existed there, and I don't think that they should be dismissed lightly. I think, and that's why I raised the issue that if the idea of promoting civility is to diminish legitimate claims on resources, where you don't like the way those claims or those arguments are presented, then you run into that trouble of just solidifying the status quo using the word civility instead of something else. And I think it's something to be aware of, and that's why I said when we start to develop our thinking about this and our statements about this, that we remain clear that this doesn't mean that there will not be tension and conflict.
Sure. That's fine. I just say that when we brought in civility into this discussion in the first place, we saw it as having a direct relationship with public safety. Yeah. I mean, that's what we're interested in.
We've talked about it in pretty practical terms all along, I think.
I think we also need to be clear, and you brought up a good point, that if we're gonna talk about civility, whether, certain principles, that it shouldn't be moralistic, because then we're no better than like the religious right wing or some of the, or other fanatical groups and all. Or situation with Crestmont is a prime example, like getting involved with the Tenants Association. They want the perception to change, and then the next thing that two families on the side of the family center are playing like Hatfield and McCoy's with the shootout, so, and I don't know, are we gonna be like Dudley Do-Right to save, or Mighty Mouse to save the day, or address some of these issues to make people more aware, like the way that it used to be?
Steve, can I address that?
Yeah.
The literature gets very complex in
Yeah.
that, and I've spent much more time than I ever would have dreamed of last August, when I started this, examining that very issue. And let me just tell you a little story about what it says, because I think it's very interesting, it's very relevant to this discussion as far as is civility, is our decision to talk about civility in an elitist attitude, and is that the way it will be perceived? And the literature says that people who will hold that attitude, saying that you're being an elitist and you're telling me that I'm not civil, are the people who are really saying, this isn't my problem. And that is at the heart of civility, is when we start not taking responsibility for the fact that the homeless is our problem. And when people aren't nice in our community, it is our problem. Maybe it's not us who are the ones being incivil, but it's still our problem, and we need to take responsibilities of a collective. If it takes the elite people to push this forward and get a roll on it, the literature says, hey, more power to you. Try to get at the grassroots level going. It takes leaders to make this work.
Oh, sure, and there are always people that are gonna point the finger, but
You
I mean,
bet.
that's.
Is it John or Brad back there? Somebody wants to get it.
Well, I was, yeah. I think it's really important not to shirk responsibility. If you're talking about two children who decide to resolve their vehicular conflict by shooting each other, somewhere along the line, responsibility for something was not, was shirked, or they weren't taught something at somewhere along the line. I'm not talking about schools necessarily at all, but that's why I'm uncomfortable with us just talking about civility and talking about nice and talking about polite and not being more specific about what do we mean by that, because there are certain areas that I do feel very comfortable being involved with and saying this is the way it's done, and then there's other areas that I'm not comfortable at all trying to tell people how they should do things. That's why I like it to be really much more clear, and then we can feel real comfortable saying this is our jurisdiction. We're not being elitist here at all, and I'm very uncomfortable thinking of myself as an elitist group at all. Leadership, maybe. I hope there are times I take leadership positions on things, yes, but elitist, no, I'm not comfortable with that title. But I think if we are more clear on what it is that is our jurisdiction, then it's just, to not make decisions about that and try to affect that is shirking responsibility.
It's right on the money.
John, can I just make a final comment here? I know we need to break up, but when you look at the breadth of the proposals involved with this subject, it seems that it's a darn good start. And we ought not be afraid of labels, of naysayers and such, because as Dr. Bonder was saying, when we started this discussion about involving an element of this program to include this whole discussion, we were very clear from the beginning that we weren't sure where we were going with it. But something told us in our hearts that this is something we need to talk about. And you see it throughout society, and Bloomington's not immune. And the reason I wanted to address the issue is because I think it does have a direct relationship with public safety. And it seems to me that a society that doesn't respond to problems associated with respect, dignity, fairness, is on the verge of some major public safety problems. As a community, we ought to say to people that, we believe in democracy, we believe in dissension, and we think that that's an important part of how we operate. But when people cross the line and can't make the distinction between legitimate policy arguments and personality attacks, I think we should call them on it. Because I'm of the opinion that if we tolerate verbal violence, we're just that much closer to tolerating physical violence. And we ought to say that that's wrong. And that's not how we want to operate in our community. That's why we involved it, and I think that the range of ideas that we have here are a good start. And, there's some landmines along the way, and you have to be careful about how you discuss the issues, but it's a discussion I think we have to have as a community, because one of the essential characteristics of Bloomington that you hear over and over and over is that there is a sense of community, and that's why it's a special place. But part of that sense of community is the friendliness, the genuine compassion and caring. If we get away from that and we become almost apathetic about attacks on people, verbal attacks, stereotype attacks, etc., we're really, I think, going to lose that special quality, and we ought to talk about it and reaffirm it as a positive in Bloomington and build on it.
And all of this, stems from perspective of decentralization. I think there's not going to be a civility commission, I don't think, anyway. There's not going to be a civility czar. This is decentralized and you know.
We'll give out S's and U's for citizenship, E's for a few.
But you know, what we simply want to do, I come back to what I said at the beginning, that we hope that our report creates an environment and that the mayor and whatever form this continuation of the Safe and Civil City initiative takes will create an environment where neighborhood associations and people who work with youth and the Chamber of Commerce and everybody else will, in their own way, contribute to. In schools. In schools, especially schools, will contribute to this and make their own little contribution. This doesn't have to be centrally controlled. We don't have to agree on one definition. I think, though, that we all at some level understand the kinds of issues we're talking about. And what we want to do is create that environment that empowers people to make that difference.
You know, one thing I really find interesting, when we first raised this issue, I thought, well, this may be a crazy idea. And I told them, this may really be nutty. But it seems we've got to talk about it. And what surprised me was the number of people who came forward and said, absolutely yes. You know, and the number of people on our commission and elsewhere said, yeah, this is something we have to deal with. So I think a lot of people intuitively have felt that it's an issue that needs to be dealt with.
It resonates with me.
Yeah, and I thought John really had a good statement. I'm glad I incorporate that in the report.
So Steve, I think the first task in the spirit of that retreat that was held is somebody made the point that you need to get people away from their work environments and just get them to interact as people. I guess it was you who said just get people to interact socially. So I think first thing that needs to happen is we need a retreat with members of the city planning department and Positive Progress to go out to Bradford Woods and do team building exercises and get to know each other. Maybe that can be one of the first initiatives.
Ability training. We gotta thank Luke. I've watched him writing there for an hour and a half. He's got every word.